Welcome to CARICOM Matters. I'm Miles Eversley. Thanks for joining us. In our last program, we discussed the outcomes of the 2022 Afro-Caribbean Trade and Investment Forum and prospects for the future. This week, Assistant Secretary General of the CARICOM Single Market and Trade at the CARICOM Secretariat, Ambassador Wayne McCook, begins by discussing the nature of traditional and non-traditional trade relationships that the Caribbean has fostered.
Traditional relationships, certainly in trade, that the Caribbean region has undertaken have been with North America and Europe, based on historical patterns that we well know. Since independence, I think many Caribbean countries have sought to diversify their trade relationships, and the region as a whole has tried to do so. While it continued to build on the relationships it has with North America and with Europe, most significantly in the Economic Partnership Agreement that we struck with Europe, which is a comprehensive agreement that covers most of our trade with Europe. These have been significant and important. But the region has also undertaken bilateral trade arrangements with other developing countries, in particular with the Dominican Republic, with Cuba, with Costa Rica, and with Colombia, as well as Venezuela. Individual members of CARICOM are also allowed to undertake what we call partial scope arrangements. That is, agreements with neighboring countries that do not go beyond the benefits that they give to other members of the CARICOM single market. And these have been undertaken by countries like Trinidad and Tobago, Belize, and others. So we do have a pattern of what you have described as non-traditional trade arrangements with countries from the developing world. We've also negotiated historically alongside other developing countries in Africa and the Pacific in the context of relations with Europe. In that context, thought had been given from time to time to having an arrangement among the countries of Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, but that has not materialized. As you know, the African, Caribbean, and Pacific Group, now the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, has a long history of collaboration. And in the context of that collaboration, the conversations about an all-ACP agreement has taken place, has arisen, but has not been pursued. I think that at the moment, the challenges to building substantive trade arrangements between the different parties, I don't think the ACP group has found a way to bridge and build the bases for direct trade agreements between the parties themselves. And in its original structure, it developed its program of work around engagements with Europe. But in terms of the discussions regarding the future of the conversation on an all-ACP arrangement, that is a discussion that actually would take place in the context of CARIFORUM. And your viewers may know that while we have the CARICOM single market, which covers the members of the Caribbean community with the exception of the Bahamas, we operate in the context of the OACPS as CARIFORUM, where we operate alongside the Dominican Republic in the CARIFORUM context. So the basis for discussing that kind of engagement would not be specifically a CARICOM discussion, but more so a CARIFORUM discussion. at the same time, by working together in partnership in the engagement with Europe, there have been several areas of collaboration and synergy between the Caribbean, Pacific, and Africa. In international fora, the Caribbean has tended also to work with other developing countries to shape agreements and arrangements that are in the interest of the community.
The establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area in 2018 has provided a number of opportunities for countries and regions such as ours to trade with integrated markets of the African continent. So what are some of the key sectors in which Caribbean and African countries could trade? And what future does such a trade relationship between Africa and the Caribbean hold?
The sectors in which the Caribbean is strong and Africa would have complementary strengths or needs is where we would want to look. You mentioned the orange economy and the fact is that for cultural and historical and other reasons, there are synergies that already exist in the markets of the Caribbean and Africa in this area. Groups from our region have toured in Africa and vice versa. And we shouldn't discount the value of the organic movement of what I call cultural business persons. A soca band, a reggae band that performs to an audience of 10, 20, 30,000 in Lagos, for example, receives revenues that would be the equivalent of sending a container of product to another market. So we should recognize that where there's value, there is a basis for building a trade relationship. The trade relationship should support that value proposition. That is, if you have more concerts, if you have more streaming, if you have more supply and purchasing of the products in the orange economy, whether it's visual art, the performed works, or recorded works, it is of benefit to our our producers of creative material in the region, and can be an area of growth in trade between our regions. But I think the key question is to look at the future. And it's not just the Caribbean that sees Africa's potential. The projection is that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will present a market of 6.7 trillion by 2035. That is, while there are complexities, because you're not talking a single country, you're talking a continent with many countries, different administrations. But the Continental Free Trade Agreement is intended to deepen the integration of the markets of Africa internally and certainly in terms of its engagement with the rest of the world. So I think thinking about a future of a trade relationship with Africa as a whole is different today than it would have been 10 years ago, because the first order of business would be for there to be a basis on which you could engage in a continental way with Africa. And that is now being created with the AFCFTA. In truth, it's a work in progress because it's just been launched. But the potential is clear, both to the countries of Africa themselves that have created this instrument, but for those who are seeking to engage with Africa. So for the Caribbean, looking to Africa as developing trade power, and I use the words advisedly. I mean, it's not there yet. There's much that Africa will need to do internally to strengthen its market, to reduce its trade costs, and strengthen its productive sectors. And all of that, of course, will generate the kinds of economic growth that will strengthen the market and make those markets more attractive to those who would wish to export to Africa. The Caribbean, I think, would look to a strengthening African market as part of the future expansion of its own external trade relationships.
However, much work needs to be done in the region to expand external trade by engaging with the African Continental Free Trade Area and to realize the benefits of such expansion.
How we get there is, of course, going to require a lot of work in a lot of areas, beginning with the private sector, because it's not governments that trade, it's firms. And so one of the things that was very interesting about the Africa-Caribbean Investment and Trade Forum is the presence of businesses. One noticed that several significant African business organizations were here, and of course their counterparts from the Caribbean talking to each other. Moving from talk to action at the level of the firm is, I think, one of the things we hope to see, where investment and trade begins to flow because it's good business for African companies and for Caribbean companies. That creates a basis on which the trade arrangements can be built with purpose. So you create trade agreements to support trade. They don't all have to be what we call market access agreements, where you reduce tariffs in the hope that the reduced tariff will make your sales more attractive than those of others who don't have the same kind of privilege in the market. It's about a lot of work now is being done on facilitation. Another important dimension of the forum is the presence of one of its key architects, Afreximbank. And trade financing and trade support in a broader sense are key to growing trade performance. So I think one of the noteworthy outcomes of the forum itself was a promise by Afreximbank to develop a Caribbean presence and develop a Caribbean program. We would want to look to see how that is advanced, because to the extent that the Afreximbank, for example, is well resourced, has a history of direct engagement in trade support in Africa, and sees the Caribbean as a part of its constituency, so to speak, then it certainly will add a value and opportunity to the Caribbean in terms of its trade prospect. So that's one side of the coin. Do you have improved opportunities for trade financing, trade support, and trade facilitation? One of the things that is emerging in the Caribbean outreach to Africa is strengthened representation on the continent, whether by individual CARICOM states having their own diplomatic and commercial presence in African countries, or collective representation, which is being contemplated, for example, in Kenya and other places. That presence in the market, in the region, I think is also a potential asset in looking at future expansion of trade. Similarly, African presence in the region. There are a number of African countries with representation in the Caribbean. And we look forward to these being leveraged at the country level and also by economic actors, by firms, companies doing business, to explore opportunities to add value, whether by exports or imports from one to the other. And so we have the Afreximbank signaling an interest in doing trade support reaching into the Caribbean. We have increasing presence in each other's regions through representation at national and regional levels. And we have firms that already are reaching out into markets in Africa. It may be initial steps, but of course you don't sort of go from 0 to 100 in 1 second. I think building taking advantage of the opportunities that now exist and preparing for the opportunities that are coming would be the hallmark of good trade policy and good business policy. And I think looking to the future, as I said earlier, we need to look to where growth is going to come. And it's indeed Africa, when you look at the demographics with its strong youth population, its potential for expansion in economic and trade performance, while being realistic about the challenges that exist, we also have to look to the opportunities. And I think that that was part of the narrative in the conference, in the forum, and that perhaps was reflected in a very strong way in the summit of African and CARICOM leaders that took place in 2021, and in fact laid the foundation for the kinds of engagement that we saw in the Afro-Caribbean Investment and Trade Forum.
The forum also provided an opportunity for several academics, private sector officials from the Caribbean and Africa, development bankers, regional diplomats, and technocrats to imagine the formulation of a Caribbean-African Free Trade Area agreement, the emphasis being on imagining such a feat. Ambassador Commissiong shares his thoughts on this.
Yes, well, this was one of the items on the agenda of the conference. So this was actually a panel. It was discussed, and the panel was titled Imagining, beginning the process of imagining what an African Caribbean free trade area would look like and what it would take to bring it into being. And very powerful idea. You know, on the African continent, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area. So quite recently, all the African governments came together and decided that they're going to institute a free trade area across the entire continent. And bear in mind, this is a continent of 12 million square miles, some 54 different countries, 1.4 billion people. So that is a very powerful concept. That is, in fact, the world's largest free trade area. However, it is a new creation, and Africa still has to work on perfecting it. You know, it's a very new creation. In the Caribbean, we are working on our CARICOM single market and single economy. We began as a free trade area with CARIFTA, so we know about a free trade area. We were quite successful in establishing our free trade area in the Caribbean. But I think that to bring the two of them together now, to have an effective, functioning Africa-Caribbean free trade area, that is going to call for some work. So that's not something that's going to materialize, you know, in a few months. Or that is going to call for some work. I mean, even to make it effective, we are going to have to look at transport connectivity between Africa and the Caribbean. So to have a free trade area, obviously you're going to have maritime and air transport links between the two regions. So we have work to do. So I would not put that forward as an immediate project. I think the immediate projects are precisely the things that were agreed upon at the just concluded forum. So before we talk too seriously about the free trade area, let's get that regular flight. Even if we start with a once a week flight, let's get that. You know, these would be some of the building blocks. Before we talk of a free trade area, let's set up that Caribbean Export-Import Bank. That could be the counterpart in the Caribbean to the Africa Export-Import Bank, because talking a free trade area, you also have to finance the trade between the two regions. So we need institutions that can finance, you know. Let's get the new Africa Caribbean Business Council actually working, because again, free trade area, it is private sector business people who trade. And so they have to know each other. They have to develop relationships with each other. So I think these immediate things that we agreed upon, I think this is very sensible. This will be phase one. If we can accomplish this, then yes, we would have established a good foundation to then go on to look at that more ambitious project of an African Caribbean free trade area. But I must tell you, it's a very powerful idea. It's a very powerful idea. The idea that Caribbean businesses could, and the products that we produce in the Caribbean could have free access without any tariffs, without any taxes, you know, could have free access to the entire African continental market, all 54 countries, all 1.4 billion people. And we are being told that it's being predicted that by 2030, the consumer purchasing power of the African continent will be something like $6.6 trillion, not million, not billion, trillion. So that is a very enticing prospect, or should be, for Caribbean manufacturers and business people. So that is definitely, so the idea of the Africa-Caribbean Free Trade Area is definitely something that we should work towards. We would stand to benefit tremendously from it. However, I don't see that as, you know, a short-term objective. I think we need to focus on the concrete things that we agreed upon at this historic forum.
While acknowledging that such an ambitious arrangement will require great effort, with a sense of joy, we nevertheless contemplate what such an arrangement could possibly look like. What would be the requirements? What about the processes involved in achieving that goal? We'll continue to think of that in our next program. Until next time, I'm Miles Eversley. Do take care and thanks for your time.